Hi, so I'm hoping to just give a brief overview of what autism is. So there's three main areas where most autistic traits would fall within. The first area is differences in social communication. For example, generally speaking, autistic people might prefer to make less eye contact than non-autistic people. And likewise, autistic people generally prefer more straightforward or literal communication rather than communication that is a bit more indirect or more based on reading between the lines. Another area is repetitive behaviors and intense interests. So autistic people can generally take a lot of enjoyment and a lot of comfort in routine. We tend to thrive in situations where there is a lot of predictability and routine. And likewise, many of us have very, very intense enthusiasm about our favorite interests, which can be a great source of joy for a lot of us as well. The third area is sensory processing differences. So autistic individuals will often either be more sensitive to certain types of sensory input, such as light, sound, texture, temperature, etc., or might be less sensitive to those inputs. And just as with non-autistic people, every non-autistic person is going to have a different personality, different preferences, different life. Every autistic person is also going to have different intensities of these traits and just will be their own individual person. And one model that I think really captures quite well the many different ways in which autism can present is this autism color wheel. So you can see that even within a given category, such as sensory processing differences, there's actually quite a few subcategories within that. For example, one would be energy regulation, sensory seeking, and repetitive movements, which is a trait that I have quite a pronounced version of. Another one would be exteroception, so how someone senses the outside world, whether they're hypersensitive or hyposensitive to certain inputs. Another area could be proprioception, so how someone senses their body position in space, whether they enjoy things that provide a lot of movement, such as dancing, spinning, etc. And so each autistic person is going to have sort of their own unique color wheel. And in addition to that, someone's traits might fluctuate with time. So as both as we get older, our traits might change, and it might also change based on sort of how stressed we're feeling, what's going on in our life overall, and so on. One theory that I think is particularly interesting for describing autism, and more generally for describing the differences between autistic and non-autistic individuals, is monotropism. So roughly speaking, monotropism postulates that autistic individuals tend to focus intensely on one or two topics, whereas non-autistic individuals may focus on a broader variety of topics or a broader variety of inputs with less intensity or for shorter time periods. And although I've most commonly seen this theory brought up to describe autistic individuals as compared to the general population, I imagine that many non-autistic individuals who are otherwise neurodivergent could also experience monotropism. So having sort of set up that definition, I think it's pretty interesting to look at some of the three domains of autistic traits through the lens of monotropism. So if we think about social interactions, as mentioned, autistic individuals often are very straightforward communicators. We tend to focus primarily on the literal meaning of what's being communicated, whereas non-autistic individuals may focus on quite a few different areas of communication, but perhaps at a slightly lesser intensity. So non-autistic individuals may focus on the literal meaning of a conversation, the implied meaning, body language, tone of voice, and eye contact, and sort of develop their overall impression of a conversation by some sort of hybrid of all of these areas. Likewise, with respect to interest and repetition, autistic individuals often tend to put almost all of our focus, or at least quite a lot of our focus, on a relatively smaller number of daily routines, activities, foods, songs, and interests. For example, there's a term called same food, which describes a tendency that is not uncommon in the autism community for autistic individuals to find a food that we really like and maybe that takes relatively less energy to prepare, and to prepare it over and over for quite a long time period, to eat it maybe every day, for example, or likewise to listen to the same song over and over and over. In my case, I think there's some songs I've listened to well over a few hundred times in fairly short succession over the span of a couple of days, for example. Whereas non-autistic people may have less intense interests, but may have interest in a wider variety of activities. And again, this is very much speaking in general. But from this, we can see that autistic people might thrive in environments that supports their deep enthusiasm for certain interests, that provides routine, predictability, etc. And non-autistic individuals might thrive in environments that provide a wide variety of stimulation that may change or may allow for some spontaneity that they might need. So both groups will do best when they're in environments that accommodate their attention profiles. Likewise, with sensory processing, autistic people might have hyper-awareness of some sensory stimuli that is sort of within their attention tunnel, and might be relatively oblivious or unaware of stimuli that's outside of the attention tunnel. One other thing that I think is somewhat interesting to go through is the double empathy problem. And the reason is that autism is often framed as a list of deficits or a list of things that are kind of perceived as being wrong with the autistic person. But it's actually been found that autistic people can, generally speaking, communicate quite easily with other autistic people. There have been 5 studies here that discuss how autistic people can often relatively easily read the other person's method of communication, for example. And likewise, non-autistic people can generally communicate easily with other non-autistic people. Of course, in both of these situations, it will depend on the 2 people communicating in question, but generally speaking, there's not too much of a barrier when autistic people communicate with each other or when non-autistic people communicate with each other. On the other hand, when autistic people and non-autistic people communicate, there typically is a communication barrier and a lot of mutual misunderstanding. However, we live in a world, obviously, where the significant majority of the population is not autistic. Autistic people make up a relatively small percentage of the population. And so this sort of double empathy problem often becomes pinned entirely on autistic people, and the expectation is often placed almost entirely on autistic people to learn non-autistic ways of communication. And sometimes the expectation extends to even expecting autistic people to suppress our own ways of communication. So I think one way to bridge this barrier is to ensure that the other side is also being addressed, where we are not only teaching autistic people non-autistic ways of communication, but also ensuring that non-autistic people are given access to information about autistic ways of showing care as well. So I also wanted to discuss some areas that might be, I guess, common strengths in autistic individuals. And some of the strengths that I see brought up most often tend to be focused a little bit in productivity, or they tend to be strengths that almost lend themselves best to an academic context or a context of being productive in the workforce. And those abilities would be, for example, increased visual spatial abilities, pattern perception, systemizing. I didn't include it on this slide, but oftentimes autistic individuals may be able to memorize a fairly large amount of information about certain topics, especially if the topic is a favorite interest. And hyperfocus, which is when someone becomes very, very deeply focused in a topic, sometimes for hours at a time. And I think in addition to that, it's also important to keep in mind other types of strengths. So this is not a comprehensive list at all, but one strength that I really appreciate about interacting with autistic people is that generally there's a more straightforward communication style. I personally think it's quite nice to be able to talk to someone and not have to sort of guess what they're thinking or guess what they really mean, because generally speaking, autistic people will be pretty straightforward and direct and may state their intentions more directly. And so there's a certain genuineness there that I really appreciate. Another strength that is often found in autistic individuals is sometimes a willingness to question social norms. Of course, autistic people are not immune from certain social conventions or biases, but one of the hallmarks of autism is not necessarily following social rules or conventions as expected. And sometimes when social rules or conventions aren't necessarily healthy, it can be really good to have a group of people who's willing to question that a bit more. Likewise, autistic individuals have a tendency to think outside the box. A third area of strength is often honesty. And a fourth area of strength is a strong adherence to ethics in both public and private. So the research study that I'm citing here and also quoting is a study that found that autistic individuals were significantly more likely to reject immoral bribes, because they were very worried about, in the case of this experiment, participants were given an option to accept these immoral bribes. But if they accepted the bribe, an unethical cause would also be benefited. So if they accepted the bribe, that could be harmful to others. And they found that autistic individuals were more likely to reject the bribe in both situations, both in public and in private, so regardless of whether they were being watched or not. And they also found that autistic individuals were particularly concerned about how the choices that they made would impact others, and were particularly concerned about, if they were to accept the bribe, how that might negatively affect others. And part of the reason that I'm really emphasizing this study is because there's often the perception, and I think unfortunately so, that autistic individuals don't care about how we affect others, that we don't care about the feelings of others or the well-being of others. And to be honest, that's really not true. I think we, on average, I think we care very deeply, but we might just be expressing it differently and in ways that might go overlooked. On a slightly more happy note, I also wanted to include just the concept of autistic joy. Of course, there's quite a few ways in which autistic people might feel joy, not all of which will be strictly related to autism, but sometimes embracing autistic traits can bring its own sort of unique source of joy. And I think that can be very beautiful. So this quote captures it quite well. Being autistic to me means a lot of different things, but one of the best things is that I can be so happy, so enraptured about things that no one else understands, and so wrapped up in my own joy that not only does it not matter that no one else shares it, but it can become contagious. And one area that I think can often bring autistic joy is stimming. So stimming is a repetitive sensory input like rocking, hand flapping, making repetitive noises, etc. And one really cool feature that stimming can sort of do is, if there's an unpleasant external stimuli, for example, maybe an unpleasant background noise, stimming can help almost replace that unpleasant sensory input with something that's more pleasant and that's more predictable. And so stimming can reduce anxiety, it can bring enjoyment, relaxation, help with awareness of body position, and help with focusing. And I think this quote also really nicely illustrates the benefits of stimming. I was feeling anxious and I didn't know why. While rocking, my mind calmed and the answer about my anxiety came to me. I had been overly worried about a person I could not help. I immediately felt relieved and was able to actually be supportive to them later that day and not just freaked out over their problems. So the last couple slides I'm going to show here might be going in a slightly different direction, in the sense that they're not necessarily describing what autism is or what autistic traits are. But I think they're also very important and closely related topics. I guess from my perspective, the heart of pursuing a neurodiversity affirming approach, or even like an autism affirming approach, is recognizing the inherent worth of each person. And I don't think that there's much that I can add to this quote. It's a very beautiful quote, I think, by Amy Sequencia, who is non-speaking, so writes to communicate, autistic individual with multiple disabilities. My parents and my family also like to say how intelligent I really was. The reason might be because of all the years of feeling frustrated with the prognosis of a tragic future given by all the doctors. Having a daughter that had finally proved her intelligence might have felt like vindication. Today I know better. I know that being human should be enough to deserve rights. I know that the reason I type is not to prove that I am intelligent. I type because I have words. Am I intelligent? I don't care. I am me and I deserve the same rights as any human being. If I am not respected as a person, incredible super intelligence powers will not change that. And I think one way that this does sort of relate to just the introduction of what autism is that unfortunately, there has been this tendency historically to try and almost partition the autism spectrum where there's functioning labels. People who are labeled as high functioning are often deemed to be more worthy than those who are labeled as lower functioning. And so I really hope that by remembering just the inherent worth of each individual, we can move past that sort of way of thinking and evaluating someone based on their perceived functioning level. Finally, I wanted to discuss diagnostic disparities. And I think diagnostic disparities also motivate the need to realize that not every autistic person has had equal access to an official diagnosis of autism, or will feel equally safe pursuing an autism diagnosis, for example. So some areas of disparity would be, for example, race-based disparity. Black autistic children are disproportionately likely to be misdiagnosed with conduct disorders than white autistic children. For example, a behavior that's perceived as eccentric in a white autistic child might be perceived as threatening or defiant in a Black autistic child due to racial bias. Another area of diagnostic disparity is that autistic women on average experience an 8-year delay in diagnosis. And a third barrier to diagnosis is that diagnosis and other services can be expensive. Particularly for adults, diagnosis later in life is something that's often reserved for those who have insurance that will cover it, or who have significant financial privilege that allows them to pay, for example, the full cost of a diagnosis, which in some areas can range up to $2,000. So depending on someone's financial situation and the cost of diagnosis in their area, it can be very difficult to access a diagnosis. And that's not even to mention potential wait times as well. And I'll just end with this quote by Lydia Brown, saying, "The school psychologist amazingly insisted that I couldn't actually be autistic. Instead, because I was adopted transracially and transnationally, he believed that I had reactive attachment disorder and therefore did not qualify for services." So I guess that's the last slide I had for this presentation. I hope it's given just a little bit of an overview of what autism is, maybe how monotropism relates to autism, and what some autistic strengths are, as well as the importance of, I guess, hopefully building a world that has a better understanding of the inherent worth of each person and more equal access to diagnosis. Thank you. Let's see.